Selena, tell us a little bit more about what Mark Zuckerberg is arguing for here and who would create these global internet rules.
Now, the sentiment here is that Mark Zuckerberg is trying to get in front of any stringent regulations that may come, and it's really in Facebook's self-interest to have a strong voice in this discourse, because whatever regulation comes inevitably is going to have a big impact on Facebook. So he's really calling for a new global internet regime, and he touches on 4 key areas: harmful content, so that's issues like terrorist content, abuses content. He talks about election integrity, that covers political advertising, privacy. He calls for GDPR to be spread around the world, and also data portability, which talks about allowing users to freely take information from one network to another.
Sally, is this something that you or the Open Markets Institute supports?
I think it's very silly, honestly, for Zuckerberg to be out there promoting regulations to fix problems that his business model is causing. You know, he has the power to fix these problems by changing his business model, because the targeted advertising business model is the reason why fake news and harmful content is being amplified by Facebook's algorithms. And it's the reason why Facebook is collecting so much data on us that foreign agents are able to target us on the social media platform. So he can fix these problems. He doesn't need the regulators to fix them for him.
So, Selena, there's actually been a lot of criticism of Mark Zuckerberg's plan. We have one lawmaker, David Cicilline, saying rule number 5 should be that Mark Zuckerberg doesn't get to make the rules anymore. Facebook is under criminal and civil investigation. It has shown it cannot regulate itself. Does anyone even want his advice? Well, to be fair, he's not saying Facebook should regulate itself. He's saying Facebook can't regulate itself, isn't he?
I think the criticism around this is that, does this amount to anything more than just a glorified public relations document that's trying to punt off any of the blame onto the government and shield itself from any future criticism? For instance, when he's talking about these regulations around harmful content, this is actually beneficial to Facebook because inevitably mistakes are going to happen, and now when they do happen, they can say, well, we were just following the line. The other issue is around things like global complex regulatory regimes. Something like GDPR has been argued that it actually helps a lot of these larger players more than the smaller players, because it's very cumbersome for a small company to have to comply with these rules. And by making this a global standard, it could actually increase Facebook's wherewithal. And in addition to that, some of Facebook's behaviors have been counter to what they've been saying. For instance, this back-end integration that they're doing of WhatsApp, Instagram, and Facebook Messenger actually increases its power over user data. It brings into question issues like data privacy and makes it harder for regulators and Facebook to moderate what's going on these platforms if they're encrypted and they don't have access to what's actually being said.
Sally, is it possible that both of these things could be helpful here, that Facebook could do more to regulate itself, but also that governments around the world could do more to cooperate to regulate Facebook?
I think governments around the world definitely need to regulate Facebook, but I don't think they should be taking their cues from Mark Zuckerberg. I think there are other options, things like interoperability, that could open up competition much more effectively than the data portability that he proposes. And I also think these half measures that he knows are not going to be effective, like the GDPR, so far has not been very effective at accomplishing its goals. So he's proposing things that he knows won't really fix the problems, won't really require Facebook to change the way that it does its business, and won't impact Facebook's profitability, but also just won't work. So yes, regulators need to get involved, but they don't need to be taking advice from Mark Zuckerberg.
What will fix the problem, in your view?
So I think interoperability, as I mentioned, would be a big way to allow entry into competition, which would be things like, you know, for example, your Verizon wireless phone can communicate with an AT&T wireless phone. So allowing communication between networks could actually allow competition to open up. Data portability won't do that, because if I take my data, where am I going to take it to? I need to be where all my friends are. So that's why interoperability is a much better solution. Also, opening up APIs for competitors in a secure way is another proposal that's been made. And I do believe that the integration of WhatsApp, Instagram, and Messenger that's planned should be prohibited by the FTC, and that those deals should actually be unwound.
Selena, you know, David Cicilline mentions criminal and civil investigations. There are questions about whether the FTC would have some oversight of this, marriage of the back end of Facebook Messenger, Instagram, WhatsApp. How are we expecting these investigations to play out? Because it will likely be years, right?
It can be difficult to keep up with the number of global investigations that are going on and at what stage of the process they're at. As you mentioned, the FTC is looking into these issues, potentially unwinding parts of Facebook, but that will be complex, difficult, and drawn out. And many experts say that integrating the back end actually makes it harder for regulators to be able to separate the data. There's also concern that Section 230 may be under pressure. Now, this is the part of the law that essentially exempts the social platforms from being liable for the content that's on their platforms. And if that was rolled back, that could have a really big impact on Facebook. But we're already seeing other governments move ahead with regulations, even as the U.S. stalls. For instance, we just reported that Singapore is coming out with new laws that would hold companies like Facebook liable for false information, force them to take them down, and show what corrections they're making.
Sally, are there any governments outside the United States that you feel are getting it right or have a good model for that other countries could follow when it comes to creating some sort of framework to better govern big tech, given that big tech clearly isn't doing a very good job of regulating itself, even though you and many people think they should?
I think the GDPR had promise. Unfortunately, I don't think it's being adhered to and it's not being enforced properly. I think there are things that you can learn from the GDPR. I actually think the California privacy measure also has promise, and I'm concerned that big tech is out there promoting other laws in other states like Washington State with the goal of eventually getting a weaker privacy law at the federal level to preempt the stronger California law. From the antitrust perspective, the German authority just did a very innovative case where they said that Facebook abused its dominance by violating the GDPR and collecting too much data from consumers. So I think they have a real good clue of where things are going. And the European Commission has at least enforced its antitrust laws against tech platforms, although it hasn't done a great job following up on the remedies that's insisted upon in its decisions.